All right, joining me now is Brad Rowland at BT Rowland on Twitter, writing for Dime and for his own Patreon, as well as the host of the Locked On Hawks podcast. Brad, thank you so much for taking the time this season, man. Really looking forward to speaking with you about the Hawks this year.
Absolutely happy to do it, and always fun to talk ball.
Should be great. And talking ball, I mean, got to start with the Hawks here. Should be a very intriguing team. Not as many changes as one might think, but I do see a loss with John Collins in at least a couple of different categories, but maybe a gain in some other categories by giving some opportunities to some other players. What do you think is the most interesting thing about this Hawks team going into the year?
You kind of tease it out there in that they didn't do a ton. And, before last season, they had been in the play-in 2 years ago, and they kind of made their big splash move with Dejounte Murray, thinking that would take them back to kind of where they were the previous year, which was a conference finalist. And that didn't obviously happen. They kind of returned almost exactly to where they were the previous year, which was getting out of the play-in, losing in the first round in pretty lopsided fashion. So, and they kind of ran it back this time around. You mentioned Collins not being there. That's the biggest personnel change, and that's a minus, not a positive. Even if you think that they have internal guys, and they do, that's not a plus to your roster to lose John Collins and for nothing essentially in a trade. I think the biggest thing is that they're really banking on the work of Quin Snyder. That's kind of the messaging and the way that they're talking both on the record, behind the scenes, all that stuff. They're banking on a combination of Snyder and internal development. And yes, Snyder came in the middle of last year, but I think it was such a bizarre situation. I think outside of Atlanta it didn't get covered that way necessarily, but a guy with his pedigree taking over as late as he did for a team that was not tanking or not rebuilding, like they were trying to win. It just doesn't, that never happens. Like I couldn't find a parallel to that, and they all
Right.
acknowledged how weird it was. But the big thing is that they now have a full summer, a full training camp, kind of the full install with Snyder, and they're hoping, I think internally especially, that that's going to kind of pay off for them because it's really their big addition.
He's an interesting coach. He has always gotten the most out of a lot of his teams. The Utah teams were very familiar here with in Denver, and he's always done a great job of especially maximizing during the regular season. I got to be honest, when I was building out the roster, the rotation, the depth chart for this team, I forgot about AJ Griffin when I didn't even put him in my top 10 because there's so many other talented names that you could really point to on this Atlanta team. They've got a lot of guys that you can really pick and choose from. How do you see the starting lineup breaking down this year? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? And are maybe some of the young guys ready to step into larger roles?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, the big question in terms of the guys who are still here is who breaks out, if anyone, out of the young guys. Like you said, AJ Griffin, Jalen Johnson's a name that people are going to be familiar with. It's going to play more. He's also, I would say, in contention for the fifth starter job because really, the starting line from last year, only Collins is gone, and you would expect that they're going to run it back with four of the same five, being Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, DeAndre Hunter at one of the forward spots, and then Clint Capella, as long as he's still on the team. And there was some talk about maybe him being traded in the summer. As long as he's here, he's going to start, I would imagine. So there's that fifth spot, which is mostly power forward. DeAndre Hunter can play a little bit at the four as well, but it seems to me, and look, it's not certain at the time that we're talking, but I think it's going to be either Sadiq Bey, who is more of the offense floor spacer, more of a combo forward type, or it's Jalen Johnson as the fifth starter, and he's more of a interesting kind of hybrid player. He's power forward size, but not a great shooter. That'd be more of the defensive option. So I don't want to build it offense versus defense, but it kind of is in some ways because Bey is certainly more of an offensive player. But that's the only really, at least for me, the only real point of question is that fifth spot.
It should be fascinating. That's actually Jalen Johnson's not actually the name I thought you were going to bring up. I thought you were going to say AJ Griffin. I think Onyeka Okongwu has a great case to be the starting center for this team going forward, just going into his fourth season, and he's going to be one of those interesting names that he nearly outpaced Capella in the minutes department this last year, and I think they're going to want to continue to build around him and put him into positions to succeed, I assume, but it should be interesting to see where the kind of that dividing line is because I look at the bench for the Hawks and there's just a lot of talent there. There's a lot of interesting pieces there. Still not sure how it's going to fit together, but I guess that's a job for Quin Snyder and not me.
Yeah, and when you mentioned Okongwu, I'm very high on Okongwu. It's really a delicate balance because I've long thought that they were going to trade Capella by now, honestly, and I say that as someone who is very high on Capella. As I think he's still a pretty good starting center. It's just that they have basically two starting centers, and maybe this is the first time they finally try those guys together. To this point, they've not really played at all together, and that kind of limits. At that position in particular, center more than any other spot. If you have two centers, they really don't play a ton together unless you're just comfortable with that. So that's something to keep an eye on because, yeah, I think long term it'll be Okongwu for sure as the guy. It's just we haven't reached that point yet that they've cleared the decks for him. But yeah, this is a team that has some pretty decent depth. You mentioned AJ Griffin, of course. They brought in some quality, kind of low cost but high profile veterans. Patty Mills is here on this team. Wes Matthews on this team. Again, on the minimum for Wes Matthews. But guys who could kind of be plug and play. And then their sixth man is Bogdanovich, and Bogdan is, one of the best six men in the league in that role. I mean, he's certainly showcased that he is healthy in the World Cup this summer, and that's been the only limitation for him the last couple of years is he's had some knee trouble. But if he's healthy, he's a really dynamic offensive player that is probably overqualified for the role he's in, honestly. But when you have a team that has Trae and Dejounte, it's kind of tough to start Bogdanovich, but he's very, very good as a sixth man option, and they have quality. They have probably 10, 11, 12 guys that I would describe as rotation players, and that's not a bad place to be, especially when you add a couple of veterans that don't have to play in Mills and Matthews. They certainly can if they're asked to.
I think it's completely fair, and I look at this team and I look at the way that they tried to play last year, where you have Trae and Dejounte, you stagger those guys, you play them as the starting backup point guards for each of those units, and there's a lot of different ways that you can get creative. They're not always going to play together, but the one thing I really wanted to point out when focusing on this team, I was looking at some numbers for them. Plus 0.3 net rating when Trae and Dejounte share the floor together. What's up with that?
Yeah, it was one of the there are two questions. There's this whole theory of the case that I won't do the long version for you, but when they traded for Dejounte, it was two things. It was having someone to play with Trae who could defend at the point of attack and also take some of the heat off him because, Trae is awesome and he's going to carry their offense a lot, but they've never really had that number two creator next to him. And then almost especially they wanted Dejounte to single-handedly boost things when Trae was off the court, because that's been a disaster for the entirety of the Trae Young era. Whenever he sits, it's very similar to Jokic in Denver. Not quite as bad as that, but you know what I mean? Sure. It's like when he sits, it's just the end of the world.
Right.
And really none of that came to fruition, unfortunately, for the Hawks. And that kind of leads to why they weren't so good last year in some ways, is that, like you point out, they were not a disaster when they played together. Like, net even is not horrible, but it's not what you need. I mean, if you're going to have your two best players playing together and you have aspirations to be a high-level playoff team, you can't be a plus zero, essentially, when they're playing together. Yeah. And then when Trae sat, they were still awful. Maybe they were slightly less awful than previous years, but they were, -6, -7, however you want to look at that, depending on which set of numbers you're looking at. So I think they're hoping that Snyder's going to put them in better positions. I even called my shot a little bit on this one last year. I think Nate McMillan was probably the worst possible coach to have those two guys. And look, I think Nate's gotten a lot of heat locally, probably too much in some respects, but he's a very old school, not innovative guy. And I think when you have these 2 point guards, and that's really what they are, playing together, some creativity is going to be necessary. And I think some off-ball actions that Trae's not necessarily capable, well, maybe not capable, used to running, I would say. And then DeJounte's kind of a limited off-ball player. I mean, that's one of the sneaky things. Like, Trae Young is too good to be put off the ball a lot, but Dejounte Murray is a pretty limited off-ball player. He's not a great shooter. Like, he's an okay shooter, but he's not comfortable in that role. So there's some work to be done there, and I'm glad you brought it up, because if they get where they want to go, they're going to need those guys to be, +5, +6, +7, whatever that number is. It can't be +0, +1, or they'll be back in the play-in again, probably.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a question mark, but they have the talent and the surrounding, I think, supporting cast to really help boost those numbers. There's no reason why lineups with Trae, Dejounte, and then a couple of the wings and forwards, and then one of the bigs, all of those lineups should be relatively good. I don't see why they wouldn't be. They've got the talent to do so. So I guess my question is, last year, go 41-41, first round exit. Give a couple nice games against the Boston Celtics in the playoffs, but nothing too crazy. Does your win total really change that much? You lose John Collins, gain a couple of vets, but nothing too crazy. Does your win total change from 41-41 too much?
Yeah, I would certainly take the over on that number this year. for a couple of reasons. Number one, I do think that Snyder is an upgrade, and especially the regular season, coaching at that level can really kind of matter, especially defensively, like just system building and having more, because this has been a bad defensive team for the vast majority of the last 4 or 5 years. Even when they made their run, that was their best defensive team that they've had, but it wasn't a great defensive team. But I think that the combination of better infrastructure, a little bit of internal development, and I think crucially more shooting on the floor. Last year they were, I think, 7th in offense, which is still quite good, of course, but a lot of that was later in the season when they brought in Saddiq Bey, who hurt their defense. I will point that out. Saddiq was pretty rough defensively last year when he arrived, but in his defense, he was coming into a new system and kind of had to figure it all out. But immediately, the combination of Snyder and Saddiq Bey, the offense kicked up, and they were in the top 3 or 4 in the second half of the season after Snyder took over. So I think it's still a team that's going to be offense first. When you have Trae Young as your focal point, it's kind of inevitable. But I think that, generally speaking, I think that kind of their offensive floor is what we saw last year, which is like 7 or 8 in the league. Like they're going to be really good offensively. Unless Trae goes down, which of course is every caveat that everybody has with their star player. Right. But the question is, can they be better defensively? And I think that the answer is yes. How much better? Up for debate. Certainly, I would not say that there's a top 10 group in this particular personnel set, but I think with Snyder and quality center play and some other stuff to button up on the edges, getting into that like 18 to 20 range defensively, which isn't sexy at all, but that's a big step forward from where they've been the last couple of years. That would kind of push them into that kind of mid 40s win tier, and that's meaningfully better than where they were last year.
Yeah, right now I've got them at 45 wins. I think that's the right call. I think there are some questions as to what the actual structure of the team will look like without John Collins, but I think it will be better. I think it makes more sense, if I'm being frank. They had 3 bigs last year when you're playing Capella, Collins, and Okongwu, and sometimes that's just too much, and sometimes you just need 2, and they've got 2 traditional bigs. They're going to be very good with both of those guys on the floor. And there's no reason why Okongwu can't take a step forward. There's no reason why AJ Griffin and Jalen Johnson can't take a step forward and really provide a little bit more stability than maybe they did last year. So I like them. I think that they're going to be good. I have them at 5th in the East right now, and I have them as a second-round exit because I have them playing the Philadelphia 76ers in the first round, in which case I think I would take Atlanta, but I'm not sure I see much more than that. Do you see a pathway for this team to make a deep-ish playoff run?
I mean, I would say it's not particularly likely. Is there a path? Sure, there is. I mean, like you mentioned, the offensive fit with Collins was a little bit clunky. It always was because he's better as a pick and roll guy, and that they couldn't really have him do that next to a traditional center. It's like one of those things that Quin Snyder has this team now that fits better to his liking with more spacing around him. But like we've seen them be an interesting playoff team. Of course, it was 2 years ago. It was a weird season, but they did make a run, and they pulled off an upset against Philadelphia, and then I think people have kind of forgotten that was a close series against Milwaukee. They didn't get blown out by the Bucks. That was kind of a surprising in some ways, and I'm not saying they're going to do that again. But I think the combination of the offensive ceiling that they can reach, and a coach that knows what he's doing, and an East that like outside of the top 2 is probably kind of open. I'm not saying that they're like going to be the 3 seed or anything like that, but I think there's a pathway. It would probably take them getting a top 3 or 4 seed to have them get into a second round or beyond discussion, because if you start facing off with teams at the top in the first round like they had the last 2 years, that's tough sledding. I think the upside is it's real. I think they're probably a piece away though. Like if they had made the Siakam move that got rumored in the offseason, that would have been kind of a push in your chips kind of move, and then things would have been raised up. But as it's currently constructed, I think reasonably this is still a similar roster that was 41-41 last year. So like asking them to kind of make a leap without, and there were no huge injuries last year either. It's like almost all internal development and Snyder. And like, yeah, you can get better, but like saying, okay, conference finals time is probably a little bit aggressive, I would say.
We will see what happens. I am looking forward to watching the Hawks, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Brad, over the course of this season. Should be a lot of fun. Again, Brad does great work for his Patreon, for Dime, for Locked On Hawks. Make sure to go follow his work throughout the season. Thank you so much, Brad.
Thanks for having me.